New York City. The morning of May 25, 1979. 6-year-old Ethan Patz had been asking his parents for weeks for something most 6-year-olds eventually ask for: permission to walk to the school bus stop by himself, without a parent's hand holding his the entire way. It was only 2 blocks, a short, ordinary stretch of Soho sidewalk between his family's loft apartment and the corner where the bus picked him up. A walk lined with the same industrial buildings and small storefronts that made up the entire neighborhood at the time. His parents, Stan and Julie, finally agreed, weighing his growing independence against a neighborhood they genuinely believed was safe enough for exactly this kind of small milestone. That morning was going to be the first day Ethan made that walk entirely on his own. A small, ordinary rite of passage that happens in some form in almost every childhood, in almost every city, on almost every unremarkable weekday morning. The kind of moment parents everywhere both look forward to and quietly dread in equal measure. Ethan never made it to the bus stop, and the 2 blocks between his family's front door and that corner would become, over the following 4.5 decades, one of the most exhaustively investigated, endlessly re-examined stretches of sidewalk in the history of American criminal justice, walked and re-walked by detectives, reporters, and amateur investigators for generations afterward, none of them ever quite able to reconstruct exactly what happened along it that morning. Before we go any further into what happened after that morning, I want you to understand who Ethan Patz was, because a case that becomes this thoroughly woven into an entire country's cultural memory can sometimes lose the actual 6-year-old boy underneath the symbolism. He lived with his parents and 2 siblings in a Soho loft, in a neighborhood that was, at the time, still transitioning from industrial lofts into the artsy, close-knit residential community it would eventually become. A place where families like the Patzes had moved specifically because it offered enough space and enough community to raise children comfortably in the middle of a huge city. His father, Stan, worked as a commercial photographer and, by all accounts, kept a genuinely enormous collection of photographs of his own children. The kind of attentive, documenting parent whose instinct to capture ordinary moments would later, tragically, provide the entire country with the exact image it needed to search for his missing son. Ethan was, by every description that survives him, a bright, sociable 6-year-old, exactly the kind of kid excited to prove he was old enough to walk those 2 blocks alone. The kind of small, ordinary confidence that 6-year-olds everywhere carry when they're finally trusted with something new. When Ethan didn't come home from school that afternoon, his mother initially assumed a simple, ordinary explanation. He'd gone home with a friend or lost track of time somewhere nearby. The kind of small deviation from routine that almost never turns out to matter. By evening, when no explanation had surfaced, panic set in completely. And what began as a worried parent's phone calls around the neighborhood became, within hours, a police investigation, and within days, one of the largest searches for a missing child New York City had ever conducted. I think it's worth pausing here for a moment on just how different 1979 was from the world we live in now, because it matters enormously to understanding why this specific case became the cultural landmark it did. There was no Amber Alert system. There was no national database instantly cross-referencing missing children with law enforcement agencies nationwide. There was no expectation, built into the public consciousness the way it is today, that a missing child's photo would reach millions of households within hours of a disappearance. There was, in a very real sense, no established public playbook at all for what a community, a city, or a country was supposed to do when a small child simply vanished on an ordinary walk to school. No coordinated system connecting a single family's private nightmare to the resources of an entire nation. Ethan Patz's disappearance didn't just fail to get solved quickly. It happened at almost exactly the moment America was collectively realizing it didn't yet have the infrastructure to even properly search for a child like him. and his case became one of the primary reasons that infrastructure got built at all in the years that followed. Brick by brick, milk carton by milk carton, out of one family's refusal to simply let their son quietly disappear from public memory. Investigators pursued an enormous number of leads in the earliest days and weeks. They searched buildings throughout Soho, block by block, floor by floor, in a neighborhood full of industrial spaces and half-renovated lofts that offered no shortage of places a small child, or evidence of what happened to one, could disappear into entirely. They interviewed everyone within reach, including, eventually, a man who would loom over this case for the next 3 decades without ever facing a single criminal charge connected to it: Jose Antonio Ramos. Ramos was, at the time, in a relationship with a woman who had been hired to walk Ethan and several other neighborhood children home from school during a period when a transit strike had disrupted the normal bus routes, giving him a plausible, documented connection to the exact children he would later be suspected of targeting. He was, separately, already a convicted child molester, a fact that made him an obvious, deeply unsettling figure to investigators once his connection to the family surfaced. For years, and then for decades, Ramos remained the case's central, unresolved shadow. The man almost everyone quietly suspected. The man who was eventually convicted of molesting 2 other children in Pennsylvania and sent to prison there. And yet the man who was never criminally charged in Ethan's disappearance specifically, because prosecutors, for all their suspicion, never accumulated enough hard evidence to bring an actual case against him. Year after year, decade after decade, as the trail around him grew colder without ever fully closing. Ethan Patz, Ethan's father, eventually took a legal step in 2001 that reflects, I think, just how much unresolved grief a family can carry when the criminal system simply can't close a case. He had Ethan formally declared legally dead so that he could pursue a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Ramos directly. A lawsuit criminal charges had never been able to deliver, a full 22 years after his son disappeared. It's a strange, heartbreaking kind of legal maneuver, using the machinery of a civil court, built for disputes over property and damages, to pursue some measure of accountability that a criminal court had never been able to provide, more than 2 decades after his son disappeared, simply because no other avenue remained open to him. Meanwhile, Ethan's case had already permanently reshaped how the entire country thought about missing children, in ways that touched nearly every household in America eventually, whether they ever learned his name specifically or not. His photograph became one of the very first images printed on the sides of milk cartons nationwide, part of an early, improvised public awareness campaign that, at the time, was almost unprecedented. Turning an object that sat on breakfast tables in millions of American homes every single morning into a kind of ongoing, quiet search effort, his face staring up at families across the country from the exact same spot where they poured their children's cereal. May 25th, the date Ethan disappeared, was eventually designated National Missing Children's Day in the United States, a permanent annual marker directly tied to his case, observed every year since, decades after most of the country has forgotten precisely why that particular date was chosen. And Ethan's disappearance is widely credited as one of the catalysts behind the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, an organization that, to this day, coordinates search efforts, public awareness campaigns, and support for families across the entire country, employing technology and search protocols that didn't exist in any form back in 1979. Almost none of that existed before Ethan Patz disappeared. All of it exists now, in significant part, because he did. I want to sit with that legacy for a moment, because there's something genuinely strange about it. An entire national infrastructure for finding missing children was built, piece by piece, directly out of the fact that nobody could find this one specific little boy. Every parent who has ever seen their own child's photo distributed instantly through an Amber Alert. Every family who has ever benefited from a coordinated, immediate, nationwide search effort, every school that has ever run a stranger danger safety program is, in some indirect but very real sense, standing on infrastructure built out of the 4.5 decades New York City spent not knowing what happened to Ethan Patz. It's a strange kind of inheritance to leave behind, an entire generation of protective systems built in the shape of the one child none of them managed to protect in time. For 33 years, despite Ramos's shadow hanging over the entire case, no one was ever criminally charged with Ethan's murder. Detectives who had worked the case as young officers retired without an answer, handing case files down to successors who inherited a mystery that had already outlasted entire careers. The case moved in and out of active reinvestigation as forensic techniques slowly advanced around it, occasionally reopened with fresh enthusiasm whenever some new lead surfaced, only to quietly stall out again months later, without ever producing the one thing that would actually matter: a name attached to enough evidence to bring to trial. An entire generation of New Yorkers grew up with Ethan's story as background cultural knowledge, a permanent local legend of a boy who simply vanished, discussed in the same breath as the milk cartons and safety assemblies his case had helped inspire, without most of that generation ever expecting an actual arrest to follow. That finally changed in 2012, and the way it happened is almost unbearably ordinary, in exactly the way so many of these cases eventually turn out to be. A man named Jose Lopez called police with information about his brother-in-law, a man named Pedro Hernandez, who had, decades earlier, told a church prayer group that he had killed a child in New York City. Hernandez had been 18 years old in 1979, working as a stock clerk at a small convenience store on the exact route Ethan walked toward his bus stop, a store that sat, for over 3 decades afterward, quietly unexamined by an investigation that had somehow never circled back around to interview him directly, despite his name appearing in old case files connected to the neighborhood. 33 years. That's how long Pedro Hernandez's name sat in police paperwork, connected to the right neighborhood, the right time frame, without a single detective ever picking up the phone to ask him a single question about it. When police finally brought Hernandez in for questioning in 2012, he confessed. First during roughly 7 hours of interrogation before he had been read his Miranda rights, and then again, on video, after officers corrected that oversight and advised him of his right to remain silent and have an attorney present. In that recorded confession, Hernandez described luring Ethan into the convenience store with the promise of a soda, leading him down to the basement, and choking him there, an account delivered, according to those who reviewed the tapes, with an unsettling, almost matter-of-fact specificity. He said he then put the boy's body into a plastic bag along with the store's ordinary trash and left it out on the street roughly a block away, indistinguishable, in that specific, horrifying moment, from any other bag of garbage left out for collection on an ordinary morning in 1979, disposed of so completely and so mundanely that it explains, in its own bleak way, why searchers combing the neighborhood for weeks afterward never found anything at all. Ethan's remains, despite that confession and everything that followed, have never been found. The convenience store itself long since converted into an eyeglass shop, its basement having given up whatever answers it might once have held decades before anyone thought to look there specifically. Hernandez had reportedly told this same story, in less formal terms, to multiple people over the intervening decades. To that church prayer group, to his own wife, to a childhood friend. It sat, apparently, as a kind of quiet, unresolved confession he'd been carrying and occasionally sharing with people close to him for more than 30 years, never quite reaching the ears of anyone connected to actual law enforcement until his brother-in-law finally made that call in 2012, a full generation after Hernandez had, by his own account, first started telling people what he'd done. Before we go further, I want to know who's sitting with this story tonight. If you're watching, drop your country and the time where you are down in the comments. I find myself thinking, with a case this deeply woven into an entire country's collective memory, about how many different corners of the world have absorbed some version of Ethan's story, whether through the milk carton campaigns of the 80s or documentaries decades later, without ever knowing the specific, granular details of what actually happened to him. Just your country and your time. And then let's get into what happened once this case, finally, 40 years overdue, actually reached a courtroom. Because the road from that 2012 confession to any kind of legal resolution turned out to be almost as long and complicated as the original 33 years of silence that preceded it. Prosecutors faced an enormous challenge bringing this case to trial. There was no body, no physical or forensic evidence connecting Hernandez to the crime, and no clear motive beyond his own confession and the accounts of people he'd told over the years. The entire case rested on the reliability of a confession given by a man his own defense attorneys would argue was mentally ill, specifically bipolar and schizophrenic, with a documented history of hallucinations and, according to the defense, serious difficulty distinguishing between fantasy and reality. A psychiatric expert testifying for the defense went so far as to describe relying on confessions like Hernandez's without any corroborating physical evidence at all as profoundly unsafe, a direct challenge to the entire foundation prosecutors had built their case on. Hernandez's lawyers argued that his statements to police were essentially a kind of delusion given false shape by hours of pressured interrogation, not an actual, reliable account of a real event. They pointed instead at Jose Ramos, presenting what amounted to a parallel mini-prosecution of the man who had never actually been charged, built around his documented history, his connection to the family, and testimony from investigators, including a former FBI agent who had worked the case for a decade before eventually moving on to lead the investigation into the September 11th attacks, underscoring just how long and across how many other historic events this single case had continued sitting open, passed from one chapter of American history into the next without ever actually closing. The first trial in 2015 lasted 4 months, an extraordinary stretch of testimony and argument for a case built entirely around a confession rather than physical evidence. The jury deliberated for 18 days, an unusually long stretch of time that speaks to just how genuinely divided they were over how much weight to give Hernandez's own words against himself. In the end, they deadlocked 11-1 in favor of conviction, unable to overcome a single holdout juror who maintained real doubts about Hernandez's guilt. The judge declared a mistrial. Ethan Patz's case, which had already waited 36 years for any kind of legal resolution, was suddenly, agonizingly, right back to being unresolved. Manhattan's district attorney at the time chose to retry the case rather than let it end there. The second trial concluded in February of 2017, again after roughly 4 months of testimony, with the jury this time deliberating for 9 days before reaching a different conclusion than the first jury had. They convicted Pedro Hernandez of both kidnapping and second-degree murder. In interviews afterward, jurors described Hernandez's various confessions, several of which had been captured on video and played repeatedly throughout the trial, as remarkably consistent and, in their view, genuinely reliable, noting that he had never once, across years of subsequent legal proceedings, actually recanted or denied having killed the boy. They also described specifically setting aside Jose Ramos as a viable alternative suspect, based partly on testimony involving an unusual, oddly specific piece of evidence, an account of spaghetti thrown against a wall, offered as part of an alibi-related timeline that jurors ultimately found convincing enough to rule him out. Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The Manhattan district attorney at the time told reporters he felt a sense of relief, describing the verdict as something that might finally bring the city a moment of closure and healing after decades of unresolved grief connected to this single case. For a while, it seemed like Ethan Patz's story, at least the legal portion of it, had finally reached its actual permanent ending. It hadn't. Hernandez's legal team continued appealing the conviction for years afterward, arguing repeatedly that the reliability of his original confession and the way the trial itself had been conducted left serious, unresolved legal problems standing underneath the entire verdict. And in July of 2025, a federal appeals court agreed with at least part of that argument. The Second Circuit overturned Hernandez's conviction entirely, ruling that the trial judge had made a significant legal error back in 2017. When the jury, during deliberations, sent out a note asking whether they should disregard one of Hernandez's later confessions if they concluded his very first unmirandized confession had been involuntary, the judge had simply answered with a single word: no. The appeals court determined that answer was legally incorrect, potentially allowing the jury to rely on statements they should have been instructed to disregard entirely if they found the earliest confession improperly obtained. The court ordered that Hernandez receive an entirely new trial or be released. I want to sit with that decision for a moment because it's such a specific, almost bureaucratic detail to have this much weight resting on it. Not a question of whether Hernandez actually said what he said, not new evidence pointing toward his innocence or anyone else's guilt. A single-word answer to a single jury question, given in a courtroom in 2017, sitting there for 8 years until an appeals court finally decided it had been the wrong word to say. That's how fragile the legal architecture underneath even a conviction this significant can turn out to be. Decades after a crime, and years after a verdict everyone involved had genuinely believed was final. It's a strange thing to sit with, as someone telling this story. An entire case, spanning nearly half a century, 4.5 decades of searching, an infrastructure of missing children's advocacy built in its wake, 2 full trials, and in the end, a legal outcome that hinged, at least for a period of nearly a year, on how a judge chose to phrase a single sentence in response to a jury's question. The case did not end there either. Manhattan prosecutors appealed that reversal all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and on June 22nd of 2026, just weeks before the making of this video, in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court sided with the lower courts that had originally upheld Hernandez's conviction, formally reinstating it. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg released a statement afterward describing Ethan's murder as a crime that had changed an entire generation of New Yorkers, and reaffirming his office's commitment to standing behind what he called this important conviction. As of right now, Pedro Hernandez's conviction stands, formally and finally, at least for the moment. He remains behind bars, serving the 25 years to life sentence handed down in 2017, after a legal battle over its validity that stretched on for nearly as long as the original investigation itself had taken to produce a suspect in the first place. Jose Antonio Ramos, the man suspected for over 3 decades before Hernandez's name ever surfaced, never faced criminal charges connected to Ethan's disappearance at any point across his entire life, despite remaining, in the public imagination, the case's most persistent and enduring suspect. He died in March of 2025, just months before the Second Circuit's reversal, having spent his final years continuing to publicly and privately deny any involvement in what happened to Ethan Patz, taking with him, whatever the actual truth of his own involvement, or lack of it, any final possibility of ever directly answering for it in a courtroom. There is something genuinely unresolved sitting at the very center of this case, even now, even after a conviction, 2 trials, a reversal, and a Supreme Court decision reinstating everything. Ethan Patz's body has never been found. 47 years after that ordinary 2-block walk to a school bus stop, His family still does not have the one thing so many families in these stories eventually receive: a physical place to grieve, actual remains recovered and laid to rest. What they have instead is a confession, 2 trials, a conviction that nearly came apart entirely over a single word spoken by a judge, and a legal system that, as recently as a few weeks before the making of this video, was still actively deciding whether that conviction should stand at all. I think about Ethan Patz sometimes, a father who spent over 2 decades photographing his children, whose own instinct to document ordinary family moments ended up giving the entire country the exact photograph it would use to search for his missing son for years afterward. An image that ended up printed on more milk cartons and missing posters than almost any private family photograph in American history. I think about a man who had to legally declare his own child dead, not to grieve in private, but specifically so the civil courts might offer some form of accountability the criminal courts, for over 3 decades, simply couldn't provide. A father forced to use the language of the law to manufacture some version of closure the actual justice system had failed, again and again, to deliver on its own. And I think about the strange, almost unbearable shape of a case that essentially built the modern American infrastructure for finding missing children, entirely out of the fact that nobody could find this one particular 6-year-old boy walking 2 ordinary blocks for the very first time, entirely on his own, on a morning his parents had every reasonable expectation would end exactly the way every other morning of his short life had ended: safely, unremarkably, at home. Ethan Patz was 6 years old. He'd asked his parents, the way 6-year-olds do, for the simple, ordinary trust of being allowed to walk somewhere by himself. And on the one morning they finally said yes, that short walk became the beginning of 47 years of searching, legal argument, reversal, and reinstatement that, even now, in the summer of 2026, has never actually produced his body, only, eventually, a name, a conviction, and an entire generation's worth of protective systems built in his memory. Somewhere in that gap between 1979 and now sits an entire childhood he never got to have. A version of Ethan who would be in his 50s today, who never got to grow past the 6-year-old boy captured in the photograph his father took. The one image that ended up traveling further and reaching more people than almost any other private family photograph in the country's history. He never got to be anything other than the 6-year-old boy in that photograph, frozen there permanently while an entire country grew up around his memory. Rest in peace, Ethan Patz. See you in the next case.